A soron következő Nova epizódban 10 tényt ismerhettek meg az ufóvalóságról Karla Turner ufókutató előadásában. Az előadás angol nyelvű magyar felirattal. Ha kíváncsiak vagytok Sós Dóra kísérő magyarázataira, akkor megnézhetitek a 3 eredeti Nova epizódot.
Volt egy intelligens és karakán nő a 90-es években, aki kimerte mondani, hogy elrabolták az idegenek. Nem csak őt, hanem a férjét, a fiát és más családtagjait is. Ő volt dr. Karla Turner, a humántudományok professzora. Komoly energiákat fektetett abba, hogy más megtapasztalók élményeit összegyűjtse, és azokat tudományos igénnyel elemezze. Rendszer szinten vizsgálta az UFO jelenség sötét oldalát. Ahogy fogalmazott, minden elrablás egy invázió. Minden, amit akkor keményen kimondott, aktuálisabb, mint valaha. Az, amit ma megismertek, az ufókutatás egyik legkiemelkedőbb előadása lesz. És hogy miért hoztam el nektek? Mert itt az ideje a szembenézésnek.
Következzen egy rövid angol nyelvű részlet egy rádióinterjúból magyar felirattal. Bell Karla Turnert kérdezte 1994-ben az idegenek szándékáról.
What is it?
My best opinion is that it is some form, metaphorically speaking, of farming. That we have some source, we are a source for certain somethings, qualities or physical materials or energetic energy patterns. I have no idea, although all of those are possible given the data of the abduction report.
Hopefully, we are not as cows are to human beings.
Well, hopefully, but realistically speaking, that's not out of the realm of the data possibilities. If our cows begin to develop, say, self-consciousness, and they begin to perceive their situation more accurately, we would have a big problem on our hands. We would certainly have to change our methods of interacting with the cows. And when we see the changes that have accelerated in the past few years, 10 years, in this phenomenon, you begin to wonder what's made them change from hundreds of years of fairly static procedures.
Következzen most Karla Turner előadása angolul, magyar felirattal. Az előadás 94-ben hangzott el egy MUFON szimpóziumon.
I hope we will, by the time I'm through talking, understand all of the connotations that I imply with the title, Taken. It is not just the abduction aspect that I'm talking about. As both an abductee and a researcher into other people's experiences, I feel that I have a somewhat expanded context or knowledge of this phenomenon. My own experiences have taught me many things about the nature of alien activity, but that insight has been greatly expanded by the context of so many other reports I've been able to study, and it has helped me to see well beyond the limits of the individual experience. If we judge the entire phenomenon only by our personal experiences, we're going to get a very distorted view. The context, the patterns, the unique elements as well as the similar elements are all very important for us to have a chance of a glimmer of understanding what may be behind this phenomenon. Yet even having been through these things, lived with people who've been through these things, and studied literally hundreds of personal and first-hand reports about these activities, I know very little about the alien agenda behind this activity. Stanton mentioned the need to hold ourselves to facts in this field, and I think that is extremely important. We should repeat that 10 times a day as we go through the work in this area. The problem, of course, with the abduction phenomena, as with a lot of ufology, is that the nature of the alien activity is designed deliberately to keep us from having much in the way of concrete evidence. Designed that way. It is not an accident. So it is difficult to feel confident of many facts. The dictionary defines facts as things and ideas which are demonstrably existent, objectively verified, and known to be certain. And at this point, given everything I've learned internally and from external evidence, there are so very few things I'm willing to call facts. The list is very short. So today, instead of regaling or educating or entertaining you with abduction case reports and photos of the body markings and the drawings of the spacecraft and aliens, which I have done and could do, I would prefer to take this opportunity of perspective, which is, of course, the theme of this MUFON symposium, to share with you my list of facts, and then try to take you beyond the fringe of this phenomenon and into the heart of the abduction scenario. Now, I'm going to begin by discussing my list of facts before I go on to two other issues, propaganda and fantasy, because I think it's on the basis of the facts that I have been able to discern what I can about the data in the other two categories. So this will be a very short list. I hope you'll follow along with me. Facts. Fact number 1. We do not know with any certainty exactly what these entities may be. Extraterrestrial, interdimensional, terrestrial in origin, some combination of all of the above, something we have yet to even dream of. I'm going to use the term alien merely for convenience, and I am not implying that I believe they are from another planet. Now, certainly they may well be. We just don't know, and that's a fact. The aliens themselves have identified a number of different origins to various abductees and contactees throughout the years, but of course we humans have absolutely no way to check out any of the statements that they've made. Therefore, we cannot know these things, as the dictionary says about facts, to be certain, to be objectively verifiable. Fact number 2. And I'm stating this with all of the tact and diplomacy and self-control that I can, and those of you who know me know I have very little. At least some of the aliens are liars. Through the past decades, the aliens have made, and you all know this if you're familiar with your ufology history, have made various predictions and promises, and given a number of very specific warnings about impending events. And we have these documented at least since the early 1950s. And you and I all know, when we look at the record of what's happened since then, that very few of these things, and none of great consequence, have come to pass. This is not a reliable source. I would like to illustrate, just from personal experience, one such scenario that should make us question the things we are told by these creatures. In Into the Fringe, I recount the story of a young man that I had known since he was 11 years old. He and my son grew up together. His family and I were close friends, and I have a great deal of confidence in who this person is and his personal integrity. He went through an intense series of encounters and abductions, as we all were doing in this particular group during 1987 and 88 and 89. And one of the entities with whom he had repeated, almost regular contact was an entity who described itself as an interdimensional being, stating that its group was 10th dimensional and knew about the 11th, the way we know about the 4th dimension. This entity would appear in various physical guises during its encounters with James. Sometimes it would be a nebulous form. Sometimes it would be a human-looking woman, but sometimes only her head. Sometimes her head and her hands if there was something she wanted to show him. So it varied. At one point in an extraordinary weekend of events, which are recorded in detail in Fringe, James was compelled to go out of state to a particular area. He was at his grandparents' house and was abducted in the middle of the night and taken to a hill a few miles from there where this woman materialized in full form this time. All the body parts were there. At that time, she told him that within 5 years of that date, he and a few other people, including us and several others in the area, would be activated to perform our jobs, our tasks. That it didn't matter where we would be at that time, it didn't matter what we were doing or what we wanted, we would do our jobs. The woman told him he would know this was true because she was going to give him a series of predictions of events that would come to pass from this date through the 5-year period. And she began by telling him about a situation that was occurring right that moment several states away with people he knew so he could check this out to see if it was true. He certainly did. We all checked it out, and it was exactly true. What the woman had told him going on in the other states actually had happened, was verifiable. Of course, this made of James a believer. James was a valedictorian in a private, prestigious school. He had a career ahead of him where the sky literally could have been the limit. But the woman had told him in 5 years, you will be turned on to do your job. It doesn't matter what you're doing or where you are. And you will know this is true by the things that occur. The first thing made such an impression that she was telling the truth that James's life was put completely on hold. He dropped out of college, he gave up his plans for a career, his personal relationships became irrelevant, and he thought, I've only got 5 years, I should party, I'll make enough delivering pizza on a part-time basis that I can do the things I need to do before they take me over. Of course, none of the rest of the events occurred, but his life was effectively altered to his detriment by the lies that he had been led to believe. And you know, the best way to get someone to believe a lie is to sandwich it between a few truths, which is what, of course, the woman did. The 5 years, by the way, ended in August of 1993, and we're all still doing what we want, where we want, and we're not doing our alien jobs. The aliens have given a number of stories to people throughout the years about who they are, where they're from, and we have a list, if you compile this, and at one point I think I tried to, a list of planet origins for these beings that include everything from the planet Lanacane to Banlon. They also have given us a variety of explanations as to why they're here and why they perform certain procedures. Often, however, these explanations are contradictory. And without going into a great deal of detail, I will point out just one example. I report on this in the book Taken. Several people, abductees that I have personally worked with, have been shown cloned bodies aboard craft or in facilities. And we'll talk a little bit more about the details of these in a moment. Just for purposes of the deception and the lying capability, I will use this little story. Pat, who's one of the cases in my book, was shown a copy of her body that was in storage with a number of other human bodies. She was told it was for the resurrection. And now, if you know your Bibles, you know when the resurrection comes, we will all get new bodies. Pat was raised in a very simple Christian fundamentalist background. The aliens, throughout their encounters with Pat and her family, had used the religious symbolism to bond with the family and to instill confidence in them. They'd even had Jesus beam into the room at one point when the Greys were abducting the grandmother and say, "It's okay, they're with me." Pat was told that this body, this cloned copy, would be her new body for the resurrection, and this was extremely moving and religious for this woman. However, another woman, also reported on in the book, was shown a copy of her new body in an entirely different scenario, of course, and was told, in fact, if she didn't cooperate with the agenda the aliens had picked out for her, she could be replaced with that body and nobody'd ever notice the difference. And in a third case, we actually had that occur on a temporary basis, a woman was abducted on her way to work and shown on a viewing screen her clone going to work in her place, and nobody knew the difference. So, are these bodies for the resurrection, blessed by God himself, or are they threatened potential replacements? Aliens didn't get their stories quite straight in those cases. Fact number 3. In encounters, the human's perceptions are controlled, as are the human's conscious memories. Now, you already are very familiar, probably from the work of Hopkins and Jacobs and others, with the concept of screen memories, especially at the onset or at the conclusion of an abduction event, right? Someone may see a strange owl instead of the ET, or a little gray rabbit by the side of the car instead of an ET, or a beautiful deer, whatever. We're familiar with these screen events. What we may not be familiar with is the fact that the screen techniques go well beyond such temporary uses in the phenomenon. And we'll talk about that a little more later also. We're talking about control in fact number 3. It's also a fact that the perception of pain can be controlled and is controlled during these encounters with the particular abductees, as are feelings of physical pleasure, often sexual pleasure. And, of course, the human's emotions are also controlled during these encounters. The fact is, you are in control of these creatures during every encounter, to some degree, more or less, normally more. Fact number 4, false memories can overlay and disguise the actual events of an encounter. And even with regressive hypnosis, the abductee may recall false scenarios. I'm not talking false memory syndrome, as so much has been ballyhooed lately in the press. That's not what I'm talking about. The abductee can recall false scenarios, even under regressive hypnosis, unless some effective method is used in the hypnotic process to help the abductee bypass implanted illusions. Some of you have heard me talk before. Remember an illustration of this concerning a woman named Joy, who in the 1970s had an encounter, a missing time and relocation episode in California. Was driving in one town, 2 hours later, she's in another town, has no idea how she's gotten there. She's crying, she's in hysterics, and she feels totally abandoned and betrayed. 20 years later, when additional incidents occurred and finally compelled Joy to seek out some help to find out what was going on in her life, one of the events that she looked at under hypnosis was this 2 hours of missing time in the early 70s. She recalled in the initial stage that she was taken aboard a craft and brought by a regal and awe-inspiring figure who looked like the king and had on the robe and was very much in charge, into a room much like this, stood before a podium much like this, gazed out into an audience of wonderful smiling little grays, not at all like this, thank God, and was given a book and told to read this book to the audience. She looked at the book, and it had blue symbols or figures on it that she had never seen, and she said, I can't read this. I don't know what these symbols mean. And she was told, just put your hand over each symbol. You'll receive the impression and then recite what you received to the audience. So Joy did this, and she would touch each symbol, and as she did, she would mentally receive a very warm, uplifting, wonderful spiritual message, which she would then recite to her audience. And she went through doing this, said the response she got was one of such love, such overwhelming acceptance. She was really awestruck by the experience. When the hypnotist asked her to move forward, there was a jump, a gap in her story, and suddenly she's back in the car, crying, hysterical, and feeling very abandoned and betrayed. Now, as you know, that doesn't match up. There's a discrepancy between the emotional state she was in the car and this wonderful, awe-inspiring spiritual experience she had recalled. I think you'll agree they don't match up. The hypnotist noticed this, noticed the gap, and asked Joy to first program her mental computer to perceive only the truth. And second, to back up to maybe 5 or 10 minutes before she was in the car. When she did, Joy found herself in an extraordinarily different situation. She wasn't reading a book to a loving and warm audience. She was naked, suspended in a beam or tube of light, being poked and prodded by a group of aliens who were using her much as a biological chart, to explain, as we might to students, this is what this part does, this is what that is. And then she was put on a table, tilted at an angle, and was forced to endure some sexual intrusions. At this point, Joy, who could not move or talk, was mentally screaming to God and to Jesus, with whom she had very great faith, to help her, to save her, to make this stop. And when it didn't, and when she went through this for an extended period of time before being returned to her car, Joy came back a changed person. Abandoned and betrayed, she felt, by her God. Although she had no conscious memory of this event immediately upon her return, it changed everything in her life for 20 years. Her religion, her sexual orientation, everything about the woman. But without having the programming and help under hypnosis to see past illusion and perceive only the truth, Joy would have been one of those persons telling you how wonderful it was to be with the great alien brothers. She would have never known why the trauma and the after effects she carried for 20 years existed.
Kedves Nova nézők! Több mint 11 000 feliratkozója van már a csatornának. Hálásan köszönjük, hogy ennyien érdeklődtök az UFO valóság iránt. Lenne néhány admin infó másfél percben. Ha támogatnátok Dóra munkáját, ennek módjait a videó leírásban megtaláljátok. Vásárolhattok szuper köszönetet, lehettek csatornatagok, vannak Nova pólók is. Ha pedig kapcsolatba lépnétek Dórával, kérlek, ezt e-mailben tegyétek, semmiképp sem a Messengeren keresztül. Dóra e-mailje doragabriella@gmail.com. Ha olvasói levél helyett a saját élményeteket szeretnétek megosztani, ezt a nonhuman.hu weboldalon tehetitek meg az űrlap menüpontnál. Szeretettel látunk titeket a Facebook közösségben is. 3 csoportunk is van már. Ez a nonhuman valóság, az ufósok gyertek, illetve az ufók spiri paranormál. Végezetül, ami talán a legfontosabb, elindult az 5 perc Nova csatorna, ahol rövid, pörgős epizódokat találtok. Reméljük, azt is figyelemmel követitek majd.
Fact number 5. Given all that I've said so far, it is effectively a fact that abductees like myself and so many of you, while we report our experiences honestly and sincerely, we are really reporting alien-controlled information to the research community. As abductees, our situation is this. We can see the aliens, but we can't believe them. And we can't believe what we see them do. And I know this from personal experience as well as from a number of other investigated situations with very honest, very sincere people who are telling you, just as I have told and others have told you, what we honestly perceived as happening. We're being honest, but the illusions and false memories and distortions and controlled perceptions and emotions and responses that we had do not accurately reflect always what we really went through. Fact number 6, there's a serious element of human involvement in the abduction phenomenon, in addition, of course, to the very real alien participation. You all know, of course, about many abductees' reports of being monitored, harassed by human agents of some sort, cases of phone intervention, mail intervention, helicopter surveillance, etc. And I wish I had an hour just to talk about the human side of this phenomenon, which of course I don't. Now, in Into the Fringe, for instance, I did report about my husband's abduction and interrogation and threats by the military group in 1988. Similar, at the time, I had never heard of such a thing, and I found it even more disturbing than the alien encounters. Similar reports, though, have been made by a number of other abductees, some of whom I'm sure you're familiar with, such as Leah Haley's case, Alicia Davison in California, and some of you may be surprised to know Debbie Jordan. And part of her experiences reported a very similar human abduction and interrogation. It just never quite made it into print for some reason. In Taken, there are 4 more accounts of women whose lives have been intruded upon by what seems to be military human forces. And although I'm not at liberty, as so many of us aren't in this field where confidentiality is everything, to present to you the hard evidence that we have been able to gather in some of these cases, I am convinced by the evidence that we do have in a number of these cases, it's not an alien illusion of military. We've got names, dates, places, bases. It's real. Fact number 7. Whatever else it may be, the abduction agenda involves quite physical aims and procedures that tend to belie the idea of a primarily spiritual motivation on the alien's part. And much of what we see in these procedures goes well beyond the alleged aim of a crossbreeding program. If you think the aliens are only interested in making hybrid babies, then I invite you to figure out what these following procedures have to do with the process. First, you're aware of the various type of implants into numerous areas of the body, into the brain, through the ear, into the neck, into the spine, into the legs, the hips, and even in one man's fairly notable case, into the penis. Some of these implants have been seen on X-ray, CAT scan, and MRI. Some of them never show up. Some have been physically recovered. But so far as I'm aware today, and I do invite those who may know better to please correct me on this, whatever analysis has been performed on these objects has not given us any sensational new information. We still don't have any proof of what these things do in our bodies. What about the insertion of wires and tubes into abductees in the chest, in the kidneys, the ovaries, the wrists, the knees, and the feet, as well as the taking of human body fluids and the injection of unknown substances into the body in various locations? What about the brain operations, which in the statistics that I've been able to look at in a very general way without running them through the computer, seem to turn up as often, almost as often at least, as the reported taking of sperm and ova? In the cases reported, the individuals who've undergone or think they've undergone, because you always have to have that in the back of your mind, give an illusion, who have undergone these experiences use almost identical terms in reporting what has happened to them. I felt like my head was opened up and my brain was taken out. What about the deliberate pain experiments meant to produce levels of pain in the abductees, apparently for the measurement, study, or pleasure of the aliens who are observing them? I reported on one of these with James in Into the Fringe. He was put through an extraordinarily torturous and traumatic experience, having holes drilled in a row through the top of his head. He received an apology for this. Sorry, but we had to do it. But no explanation for why he had to do it. And most people are not given an explanation. What about the other bizarre tests and procedures that are reported time and time again? Abductees immersed in water or some liquid in which they're then forced to breathe the liquid. I think Hopkins and Jacobs have made this fairly well known to you. They now include it as one of the standard procedures. What does this have to do with crossbreeding? Are being forced to eat or drink unknown substances that then produce a variety of after effects on the abductees. Angie, reported on and taken, was given a bitter red liquid to drink, passed out immediately, and came to in a very passive, hypnotic state in which she then went through an interrogation with a number of people. Ted Rice, another case that I've been working on for a couple of years, as a child was given a pill to eat or swallow that then produced on the 10-year-old boy the effects of an aphrodisiac. What about being forced to engage in a variety of sexual, not reproductive, but sexual situations with alien beings, with human-looking figures, and with other abductees? Frequently, the alien sexual activities are reported to be carried out by reptoid-looking beings, but not always. We've got reports of gray sex, hybrid sex, and Nordic sex, among others. And just as in one of Hopkins' recently reported scenarios, I think it was on television last year on sightings, I described in Taken how Lisa, one of the abductees reported on here, was forced to have sex with another abductee in one of her encounters. It was an extremely poignant situation after the fact. The man told her, apologized to her, told her how sorry he was that he was being forced to do this to her. He said, "They've been taking me since childhood. I don't know how to stop it." And he gave her his full name. That's all he had in his control to do. What about the cloning? I mentioned this earlier. And I'm not talking about just the potential and I think very evidentially supported idea that the little gray workers you're also familiar with, like the little guy down here on the floor, are cloned, produced, manufactured like, we do Fords, Chevys. Not just this kind of cloning of the same sort of creatures to go out and do the work, but also the cloning of human bodies, which, as I said, have been shown to abductees. Sometimes they match and are identical to the human in the situation. Sometimes they're just a bunch of identical bodies, inert, adult bodies. In one case, a man was taken to a facility in which he saw a room in which there were about 40 inert human bodies, 20 male, 20 female. The males were all identical to each other. The females were identical to each other, and they were beautiful, blonde, healthy specimens. What do these things have to do, is what I've asked you to think about, with the crossbreeding agenda? Fact number 8. All of the things that I've described to you so far are part of the aliens' physical aims and procedures. But that isn't all there is to their motivations. The agenda also involves the long-term psychological programming of the abductee. It targets, among other concepts, our social and personal relationships, our sexuality, our political ideas, and our religious and spiritual concerns. For instance, many of us, through our experiences, and I think I could get a show of hands on this, are made to be highly suspicious of our government, now perhaps with good reason. And in general, we become less trusting and intimate with people outside of this field and very paranoid often of people within this field. As one of the women in the book, Jane, in Taken, has said, the aliens had fostered in her mind a mistrust of the government. Certainly it has changed most abductees' spiritual concerns and social agenda. With Pat, also reported on in Taken, the aliens, as I mentioned earlier, used a religious approach in their contacts with her, telling her very early on that they were angels, but, as they said, not as you've been taught. And they even had Jesus, as I said, appear in her bedroom to give us okay for a subsequent multiple family abduction event that occurred that night. Pat told me about this as her brother and sister who also remembered the event and said that Jesus had blonde hair and blue eyes and was very beautiful and wonderful. And I pointed out that, this is physically inconsistent with the historical Jesus that we know about from the Bible. He certainly probably didn't have blonde hair and blue eyes. And Pat could only say, well, this one did. On socio-political terms, abductees often find themselves obsessively interested in ecology, animal rights, globalism, but I've yet to see the really hard evidence other than the ecological side of this, that this is a result of alien programming or a response, a human response to our own experiences, which tend, when one goes through trauma, to make one much more empathetic to others going through trauma. On more personal terms, abductees often go through specifically sexual obsessions, dysfunction, and compulsions. Now, because of the personal nature of sexual situations, I'm sure that so many of these reports I wish we had available to us are not well known in the abduction data body, such as other things like sperm gathering, ova gathering, fetal extractions, baby presentations, and so on. Now, I know those two are very intimate and very personal scenarios, but it seems that we humans are even more sensitive about our sexuality. And if you've ever known someone who's had a sexual assault, no matter how traumatic, unwelcome, intrusive, and criminal the event may have been, the person tends to carry without a lot of help to get over it, a sense of shame and responsibility. This is also true for abductees. In private, although these reports are not often made public, in private, abductees have reported not only straightforward sexual encounters during abductions, as I mentioned earlier, but also the aftermath of such encounters on their lives. You might be surprised, and again you might not be, to know how many abductees report obsessions or compulsive masturbation after their experiences that they do not have control over. Overwhelming sexual appetites. Conversely, the loss of all sexual appetite or the fear of sex, as well as sexual obsessions with people the abductees normally would never be attracted to. Fact number 9. With their advanced technology, the aliens can create virtual reality scenarios that are usually absolutely real to the perceptions of the targeted abductee. Now, such capabilities have often been theorized and hypothesized and discussed in this field, but for me, they were confirmed in an extraordinary case, multiple case, that I have helped research for the last couple of years, involving an abductee named Ted Rice. This is the one story I do intend to tell in detail before going on. In the early 1990s, Ted was in Florida visiting an old friend named Marie, and she had also invited a third friend, a woman named Frances, as a house guest. Ted was in one room. Marie and Frances went to bed in twin beds in the other room. Shortly after going to bed, Ted heard his hostess Marie screaming, "Ted, come here quick." And he hopped up out of bed, ran down the hallway, and as he approached the other bedroom, he could see a blue glow coming through the open bedroom doorway. When he walked inside, he saw a very strange situation. His host, Marie, was pinned as far away, up against the wall, as far away from the bed area as she could, staring fixed at one of the twin beds in which Frances was still lying. The bed was surrounded by a large, spherical, blue energy field of some sort through which little lights seemed to dart and move. Frances was raised in a slightly raised position just as she had been starting to sit up in the bed and had been paralyzed in that position. Ted and Marie yelled at her, "Are you in pain? Can we help you? What's wrong?" She could barely hear them, and when she did answer them, they could barely hear her, and this is in a small bedroom. She, for several minutes, they observed, was carrying on a conversation with the ceiling. And then a few minutes later, she was carrying on a conversation with the foot of her bed. A few more minutes passed, and the sphere of electrical energy disappeared, and Frances was able to move again. When she sat up, she told them what she had been experiencing. It had begun, she said, hearing the sound of a helicopter low over the house. And in fact, she had turned to her hostess, Marie, and said, "What's a helicopter doing over the house this low, this time of night?" Marie said, "What helicopter? I don't hear anything. You're dreaming. Go back to sleep." Frances said, "No, don't you hear that helicopter?" At that point, she had started to sit up. That's when the blue sphere of energy had coalesced around the bed. Frances told them after this was over that it had seemed as if the ceiling dissolved or disappeared, and I've heard this over and over and over again, and she could see through the ceiling up to the trees above the house where there was a strange craft. She had thought it was a copter when she heard the sound, but as she looked up, it was not like any copter she had ever seen. And within this were two alien creatures, which she described in physical detail, with which she carried on a conversation for several minutes. And then she said they came out of the craft and beamed down to the foot of the bed. "Didn't you see them?" And where she carried on another few minutes of conversation. When the sphere disappeared, so did the aliens, so did the invisible ceiling, and so did the strange craft. Frances had not been able to see the blue sphere of light around the bed. All she had seen was a craft, heard noises, had a conversation with two alien entities. Marie and Ted, who were outside of this field watching this, saw and heard only the blue sphere. If they had not been in the room to observe this, Marie would have Frances would have believed with all sincerity that she had had exactly the encounter she thought she had, but she didn't. Fact number 10, and this is the last on my short list of facts. It is a fact that the aliens show a mysterious interest in the human soul. And I say mysterious because of the kinds of things they do and say concerning it. Now, this part of the phenomenon is so rarely discussed in public that I don't think we really have a good pool of data to proceed on a serious discussion, but I'd like to bring it up because it is a fact that the interest is there and mysterious, and we should be concerned about it. There are a number of intriguing reports that we could start with. For instance, a young girl who the aliens asked if they could borrow her soul. 2 different abductees, totally different, totally isolated from each other. It happened to both come from the St. Louis area, both shown at the age of 5, a gigantic metallic spherical object somewhere in space, and we're told in essence it was the Soul Recycling Center. Reports of abductees who recall apparent past lives in which they've inhabited alien bodies with their souls. And even in one case, a man who watched as his young body was killed and his soul energy released, captured in a container, and taken to a new replacement body where it was reintroduced into the body through the technology of the little black box you might have heard about in some of these cases. For me, that's the end of my list of facts.